Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for getting up early. I want to talk a little bit about some of the perceptions that people have around Agile and what I actually think is the reality based on what we've seen over the many years we've been working with Agile. There are a lot of people who think that Agile is easy, that developers and development teams want to do Agile because they don't want to do the hard work that's associated with doing programming properly. And in fact, that's really not the case. And so that's what I want to talk about. But I want to start with a metaphor that I want you to keep in mind because there are many, many aspects of Agile development that relate to these pictures. So I want to talk briefly about the tale of two toy castles. Believe it or not, you can buy a kit for that castle that's on the left. I originally found out about this picture via Neil Ford from Rich Hickey, who used this in the presentation. We have on the left the knitted castle. Very unified, very elegant, very hard to change. We have on the right the Lego castle. It isn't nearly as pretty, nearly as polished. But just think, if you had to move a tower, which one would you rather move a tower on? You'd probably be buying yourself another kit. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through this. So when we think about Agile, what is it about Agile? Well, there are all kinds of religious wars going on. Is it the practices? Is it the principles? Can you be Agile if you're a developer and you don't pair program? What if your stand-ups go a bit longer? Are you still Agile? Is there a litmus test that tells you, okay, because I do this, I am Agile? Or do the practices not matter at all, and as long as you keep the principles in mind, is that okay? And we get into these debates all the time. I think it's because computer scientists and software engineers, we just like to argue about things. If it's not this, it's the development environment, or it's what is the perfect language. But both principles and practices are important when we start to think about how do we actually use Agile on a day-to-day basis. So when I'm talking about the principles, I'm talking about things like rapid feedback and transparency and continuous improvement and sustainability and all of those things, where when we look at a task, we can say, am I doing this consistent with the Agile values and principles? And this is why you can start to see presentations on things like Agile business development or Agile legal. Our legal department within ThoughtWorks actually uses an Agile process. They don't do software development. They would be terrified, and I would be terrified of looking at their code. But they have taken these principles and looked at their work and said, how can I live out these principles? What practices make sense to me within the legal department that would allow me to be more Agile? Even our accounting department does this. It really freaked the auditors out when they realized that everybody was sitting at the same table and they were talking, and they weren't in offices, and this was just not something our auditors understood. But that's what these principles give us, is they give us the opportunity to look at problems and say, given what I understand of these values and principles, what is the right thing for me to do in this context? But these principles do inform the practices. And one of the things we often hear is, do I have to do them all? Well, one of the important things to realize about these practices is many of them are self-reinforcing. You probably don't want to do the extreme level of, you ain't gonna need it. Don't, very small stories, don't worry about what's coming later, unless you have a good test-driven development practice, a good continuous integration suite. Because if you do that, and you get yourself into the situation where there was something that is going to require a massive change, if you don't have that safety net, that was probably not a good thing to do. So you need to understand how these practices work together so that you can decide, in this particular context, this practice is more or less important to me, or I want to modify this practice in this particular way. This also allows us to start working in environments that aren't always seen as terribly conducive to Agile practices. I've been doing this long enough that I've watched this wonderful progression through the disciplines. Of course, we started with developers, and the analysts all say it's fine for developers to do this, but I need to map out my entire user journeys and scenarios before I can do anything. And then the analysts kind of got into the game. And then QAs, well, that's all fine and good, but I can't start testing until everything's written. And then the QAs came on board. The DBAs are still struggling, but we're getting them. The architects, they're still struggling too. But evolutionary architecture isn't quite as much of a dirty word as it was a few years ago. User experience. I heard exactly the same thing from an experience designer. It's all fine and good for the code to be done, but I need to design my user experience up front in all its details. There's no way. And we're starting to work through what does it mean to iterate on these things? How can we use some of the things that we've been applying to code for a long time to think about, okay, well, what do I have to have up front? What do I have to have decided? What are my guiding principles so that when I come up with something new, I can take a look at that and see how does that fit into my picture? And are there analogs for things like test-driven development and continuous integration that might help us in understanding how this user experience is going to evolve over time? So these principles inform these practices. And what we end up with then is an approach that is, contrary to popular opinion, very disciplined. Very disciplined. It's also, however, sustainable. And my personal favorite is it's grounded in reality. One of the things that I found so frustrating when I was working the old way was the project manager coming up every week and saying, how far along are you in this 3 months tasks I've given you? It's like, okay, I've got to estimate, is this 24% or is it 30%? And people often say, you get to 90% in 10% of the time and then spend the next 90% of the time doing the last 10% of the work. But being in that situation of having to say, how far along am I? There was no basis in reality. If I was depressed one day, maybe the percentage even went down because it's like, I can't see how I'm ever going to finish this thing. Agile is very grounded in reality. And once we start to help people understand the power of that, then I think we're going to get past this feeling that Agile is easy, Agile is reckless. Heard that word used a lot too. This is just reckless and irresponsible. What is responsible about me figuring out whether I'm 33 or 35% done on something when actually that's going to feed into somebody's plans on what's going to happen? And it is effective. Now I'm going to go through each one of these 4 points and try to talk about some of the principles and some of the practices that help reinforce these things. And I'm going to start with discipline because I do think this is one of the biggest misperceptions that we have. And one of the interesting things, I talk to a lot of different companies, and it's amazing how they can hold these mutually exclusive ideas in their head. Agile is all right for these small expert teams, but I can't use it with my developers because they're just average. However, my developers want to do it because they're irresponsible. So the experts, it's okay for them to do it, but if your guys want to do it, it's irresponsible. How are those two things compatible? Why is it that if somebody who's good at their job does something and it's a responsible thing to do, that someone who is perhaps not as good at their job does exactly the same thing and now it's reckless and irresponsible? I don't understand how that works. So, let's start with development, pair programming. When I look back into many of the projects that I did before I got to do things in the Agile way, you always had the hero. You had 1 or 2 people on the team that carried the entire project. You had people who knew all of the code, or at least all of the really hairy code. And heaven forbid, if that person got the flu, you were in a world of hurt. Because you had all of these other people who were maybe playing around the edges. but nobody really knew what was going on in the parts that were complicated. Pair programming introduces an enormous amount of discipline. When you're sitting next to somebody, pairing, if you're not paying attention, that other person knows. And over time, if no one wants to pair with you, what does that probably say about you? And so this gives a visibility into individual activity, even though a lot of what Agile is about is take the individual out, and this should be more collaborative. But there isn't any place to hide on an Agile team. You've got so much visibility into what's happening that you know if people aren't pulling their weight. You know if things are going wrong. You know if the infrastructure is not working properly. You know if your team dynamics are not working properly. You have all kinds of visibility into what goes on because of things like pair program, because of things like the build light. When the build goes red, you know it. You know someone broke the build, and you know how long it takes to get the build back. So there is all kinds of structure and discipline involved in keeping a continuous integration server running. If it's always red, you know you've got a very broken team. So this focus on continuous feedback, continuous integration, test-driven development, all of this gives you a lot of visibility and a lot of discipline into this practice of programming. Another one of my personal favorites, unambiguous definition of done. If you can't tell me what done looks like, I'm never going to be able to succeed. We don't want to be playing this rock game. Here, I developed your feature for you. Oh no, that's not what I wanted. Go back and do it again. I need to know what done is. This is actually one of the things that architects struggle with a great deal, because they're responsible for things like maintainability. How do I define that? What does that look like? By having this unambiguous definition of done, this story is either not done or it's done when it passes all of its tests. That's unambiguous. Now, you have a basis for this magic percentage. As long as you've got roughly similar sized points or jelly beans or whatever you use to track. If I've got 47% of my jelly beans green on all my tests, then I'm 47% done. And I don't have to worry about all of those that aren't done yet. I don't have to say, okay, well that one's 90 and that one's not even close. We don't have to worry about that. Continual refactoring. Part of what we get as a cost of how we do things in Agile is you may in fact write some things in a way that you wouldn't have if you had thought of the great grand scheme of things. That's absolutely true. On the other hand, when you look at the percentage of code across all products and projects and such that is never used or perhaps used once, I will take the little bit of additional work that we sometimes have to do when we redo things over the amount of scope that we never even have to develop. And I think this is one of the things that people miss in the discipline, is it's not only the development team that has to be disciplined, it's the users, the customers that have to be disciplined. But we give them a way of doing that through this iterative cycle. And so we do have to commit to continually keeping the code as clean as possible. Now, asterisk, there is nothing wrong with conscientiously and deliberatively taking on technical debt. There are going to be times when you say, it is more important for me to get this done today than to spend the 3 days it might take to really do it right. As long as you go back and fix it later. But this continual refactoring, every time I look at the code, I'm going to try to see, are there things that I can do to keep this improved? That's not reckless. That's not slapping things together. That's being careful about what we're developing. And of course, if you write something really bad, and somebody else now picks up the next story and sees it, that again provides a level of visibility. Now I'm focusing on a lot of these negatives, this, oh, well, there's no place to hide, etc. But very often, these are the kinds of questions that I get asked by people who are considering, going into an agile development? Well, if I don't have my formal dates, the developers are just going to run amok. If I let QAs talk to developers, the developers are just going to write things that the QAs are going to test. How they actually figure out how to do that, I don't know, but there's this whole level of mistrust that a lot of organizations have. And to me, the beauty of this thing called Agile Software Delivery is it can start to break down those barriers of mistrust. One way is through stand-ups and retrospectives. It really is amazing to watch how much less time gets wasted in a meeting when people are standing up. I've been in a lot of meetings, and the ones I like the best are the ones that you do standing up, because nobody wants to stand for 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour and a half listening to someone drone on and on and on, and the person doesn't even want to stand up for that long, even if they're droning on and on and on. So there is something magical about this. But the other thing, stand-ups done right and retrospectives done right allow us, again, to address problems. What is it that's blocking this? Do you need an additional resource? Do you need an additional machine? Is there a problem with the infrastructure? Is there a person who's unavailable? You get all of these things out so that the right work can get done at the right time in the right way by the right people. And retrospectives are a way of looking back and saying, what should we change? One of the things about the Agile process, it is one thing to say, here's the list of practices and you can check them off and we're all behaving in a magically Agile way. But it's important to look at it and say, is this working in our environment? Is there a change that we need to make because of our team, because of our organizational culture, because of the relationship between IT and the business users? Are there things that we have to do differently? And that's what retrospectives are there for, to allow you to reflect and say, are there things I should be doing differently? So really, to sum this up, even though Agile does have this reputation of it's the cowboy developers running amok, it's reckless, it's irresponsible, how can you do such a thing? Oh, you can't do that for anything mission critical. All of those things are false, but that's the perception that is there. But in reality, cavalier attitudes cannot survive on an Agile team. You can't have the lone wolf running off all by himself, because Agile works as a team process, as a collaborative effort. And it's actually one of the things I find interesting too. I spend a lot of time talking to women in technology groups. And I must say that the technical industry does not have the greatest reputation among women. I'm sure that is a great surprise to particularly the women in the room. But so much of that is this picture that people have of a software developer sitting in a basement in a dark room all by themselves with the chute on the door for the pizzas to be slid in so that they have some level of sustenance. An Agile development process is nothing like that. You're talking to people a lot. You are collaborating with people. You are asking questions. You are answering. You're working very closely in a team. This is not a solo task. You can't sit there with your headphones on 8, 10, 12 hours a day and just knock out code and be a good participant in an Agile team. That's not how this works. These lone wolf attitudes don't survive, because this is, in fact, quite a disciplined, quite a structured approach. Even though it is adaptable, even though we talk all the time about what we might change, it's actually quite disciplined. Just because it's adaptable does not mean it's not disciplined. So these processes and these principles, all taken together, provide a various rigorous structure. Whether you're a QA, whether you're a developer, a business analyst, whatever role that you are playing, whether you're a customer or whether you're part of on the delivery side of the Agile team. Everybody has a role to play, and these roles work together. So in what way is it sustainable? One thing, of course, we often talk about is the sustainable pace. That's one part of the original manifesto. But it's actually much more than that. I've heard people say, for example, Agile is not sustainable because you've got these 1 or 2 week iterations, And that means every week or two, you're going to the mad dash to the finish. Whereas on a waterfall project, my mad dash to the finish, comes every 3 months or every 6 months or every year. So I'm always in this mad dash to the finish. Well, if that's what you're doing it wrong. Because you shouldn't have a mad dash to the finish. Part of what we're trying to do here is say, what does it take to be able to sustain this? And one of the things that we found going into organizations that are new to Agile is people are so excited just to see something work. The first time you spend 2 weeks on an iteration and can do a showcase, and your business users can see code, and your developers can say, somebody actually saw what I did. There's no longer the sense that they're bumping their head against the wall constantly. And so what you get is this self-reinforcing cycle of I get continuous feedback that I'm making progress. Rather than slogging away week after week after week, and then you get to the end and you go through your mad dash, and of course that runs over time. And only then do you start to feel like you've accomplished anything. So we don't want many waterfalls, but we do want this cycle to be going on. Another difficult thing is this balance of the short and the long term. One of the things that I think a lot about is architectural considerations. And I get these questions either from the developers, these architects, they just think, 2 years out, and we need to pay attention to next Tuesday. Or you get the architects who say the developers have too short of a time frame in mind. And probably both are somewhat true. We do have to balance the short and the long term. YAGME is one part of that. You need to think about consciously, am I going to do this now or not? I had a developer ask me once, well, if you take YAGME to the extreme, and some people talk about Agile as dialing all dials up to 11. If you take YAGME to the extreme, unless I know a number might change, I might never use a symbolic constant. Agile is not an excuse to be irresponsible. You shouldn't do that. Yes, refactoring might catch it and all of that kind of stuff. But just because you don't know for sure that the number of stores in your retail establishment is going to change, that doesn't mean you hard code the number 1042 into your code because you don't know it's going to change. And YAGME says, I never do it unless I absolutely know it's going to be done. Similarly, we had a project once where the only source of the data would be an old trusty mainframe that everybody knew was hard to talk to. And one of the zealots that we had on the client side got up and said, well, we can't play a story on integrating with the mainframe because we don't know that we have to integrate with the mainframe yet. We don't need anything the mainframe gives us. It's like, well, where do you think the data's going to come from? And this is the biggest risk that we have. So why don't we start figuring out how this code is going to talk to the mainframe, because this tech stack had never talked to the mainframe in this organization. We do have to balance the short and the long term. Agile does try to keep us focused in the short term, and that's good. But that doesn't mean that you can't also look at things in the longer term. The beauty is you can have the conversations about why something might be important at this particular point in time. I mentioned this before, but I think it's important enough to reiterate. Scope control limits waste. There is an awful lot of code that gets written for two primary reasons. One is people are trying to predict the future. What are my customers going to want in here? And, oh, by the way, because I only get to tell the development teams once every 18 months what it is I'm going to want, I have to dream up every possible feature and toss it in, because I won't get another chance. And the magic that happens the first time you come back to your business user for iteration 2 and say, okay, now what's the next most important thing you want? And the look on their face, like, you mean I get to say it again? I get to change my mind? I don't have to tell you everything I might possibly want to have a prayer of getting it before the next decade? Then they can start to think about what really is important, what scope really is going to matter, what are my users really going to use. And so we don't end up with these things that have 85 to 90% of the features that are never used or only used once. So you limit a lot of waste simply by going back and asking, now that you know what the world looks like, what's important to you now? And then there's the Agile contract, and I think this is what I call it. As a business user, I get to say what I want. As the development team who's responsible for creating that thing, I get to say, what is it going to take to make it? And this is one of the key changes. I've been on projects where it was the project manager that decided how long it was going to take to implement a particular feature, which doesn't make a great deal of sense if the project manager doesn't know enough about development in this particular technical stack to know how complicated it is. He has no basis on which to make this decision. So the business user comes and says, this is the feature I want, and the development team gets to say, well, this is what it's going to take to get that. And if the business user doesn't think that's sufficient, they can start to have a conversation about, how can we modify this? One of the projects that I worked on, we had an individual, and this was the name she applied to herself. This is not what we called her until she insisted. She called herself the Scope Witch. And she was respected enough in the business when she went, because this was a very complicated multi-stakeholder arrangement, when she went and said, no, you're not getting that, they respected her enough to listen. And when she came to us and said, I don't care how hard it is, you have to do this, we knew enough. We respected her enough to know that, okay, there's no reason to push back, let's just figure out the best way to make this happen. That's a very important function. And it does require someone who does have visibility and trust on both sides of that divide. As soon as you've got more than one individual acting as a customer, and I have to say, in all of the organizations I've worked with, there was never one customer. There were always the different divisions, always fighting over different things. So when you're in that situation, having someone who can be that bridge, who can do those negotiations, is critical. And you can, again, this position stops a lot of that waste. There was one particular error condition that our scope which took care of us for us. It would have taken us 6 weeks to deal with this one error condition. We ran a report against the previous 5 years, and this error condition had come up twice across the entire range of stores in that period of time, twice. It's not worth paying this team for 6 weeks for something you can say, call support. Here's the information they need to fix this. So this is the Agile contract. Your business user gets to say what they want, then you get to say what it's going to cost in time and people and effort and complexity, and then you have a conversation about what's the right thing to do in that context. And then the other part of that contract is I also get to say what constitutes done. That's that acceptance criteria. This is particularly important with architects. I very often get the question from architects, how do I know that the developers are doing what I say that they're supposed to do? I said, well, you write the acceptance criteria. We have this engine of how work gets done on an Agile process. You have a story card, which comes along with things like acceptance criteria, which leads to particular kinds of tasks. And that card isn't done until the test pass. So if you want to know the development team is doing something, you give them an acceptance test. You give them an acceptance criteria. And they can't say it's done until that acceptance criteria is passed. So this is the contract that we have around scope and around what constitutes done. And what it does is it empowers the people who need empowering in that particular situation. The business user is the one that's going to know what constitutes done, what they want to have happen, what they want this feature to do. The business user, the project manager, they don't understand enough about what it's going to take to make that feature happen, to be able to say what it's going to cost. So you empower the people who actually have the information to make the decisions. And finally, there is no need on an Agile team for the heroes. This really is a team effort. You don't need one individual that is carrying the weight of the entire project. That doesn't mean you're not going to have some people who are more experienced than others or something like that, but this is a team effort. You don't need that lone wolf going off and working until 3 o'clock in the morning to save the day. You just don't need that anymore. So what we have is a team that is empowered to determine how it's going to work, and you've got a team, including the customer, that collaboratively and collectively decide what's the right work to do when. And when do we stop? When is far enough? And this is part of what makes it sustainable. Because the team is in control of its process, and the team includes the business users, you have this process that can go on and on and on. And you don't need to have a weekly or monthly or a yearly 100-hour weeks, everybody, all hands to the pump, or whatever they say. This really is sustainable because you're empowering the people who need to be empowered to do the things that they have to do in the way that makes it most effective. And finally, grounded in reality. The number of times I've talked with people whose job is fundamentally to predict the future is truly sad, because I don't know, maybe I'm just incompetent, but I'm really bad at predicting the future. And that's what a lot of these waterfall projects end up doing. You're going to try to imagine in 5 years' time what things are going to look like when this thing goes live. You're going to try to imagine what technology and expectations are going to be like 18 or 24 months from now. You're trying to imagine how people might want to reuse your code so you can have the magic reuse fairy come and solve all of your development problems for you. Agile is very grounded in reality. It keeps you grounded in reality. And sometimes that's not pretty. And it's amazing how difficult at first when suddenly you're seeing, if you're using something like a burn down chart, the trajectory isn't what I thought it was going to be. And you find that out in iteration 3. As opposed to finding out in 9 months minus 5 days, oh no, I'm not actually going to finish on time. So yesterday's weather. When we talk about yesterday's weather, this basically means what a team could do before is probably what it's going to be able to continue to do, barring any other changes. Now, some people interpret that as, I can never improve velocity. Well, that's false. It depends on what is affecting your velocity. If your build server is falling over 8 times a day, fixing your build server will probably improve your velocity. If you have a brand new team that's never worked together before, your first few iterations are going to be a bit rocky as they figure out how to work together, as they figure out how to collaborate. Because this is a very collaborative process, and my ability to be productive is not just dependent on me, but it's dependent on how I work with the rest of the team. And so you might have a little bit of a rocky start, and that velocity will improve. But you can't count on it improving. Maybe you can count on it improving if you fix your build server. That's probably something you can count on. But trying to say, okay, we had a velocity of 8, whatever you're measuring velocity in, and next week we'll be able to do 12, I know it. How? On what basis are you saying that? And so planning on the basis of anything except what you have seen is risky, but we do it all the time. And people have these wonderful charts that show when things are going to happen, and they're not grounded in reality. They're grounded in this prediction about what might actually happen rather than what is actually happening at the time. Clarity of actual progress. This unambiguous definition of done is really powerful, because then you know exactly where you are. There was one of our clients in the UK. The CEO of the organization read the acceptance tests every month, because he said, that's the only way I really know what our product is currently doing. He had something that he knew was completely accurate. He knew what was working, he knew what wasn't working, he knew what was in his product because of the tests. You know exactly where you are, because anything that isn't done, you're not going to try to guess. So you know exactly where you are at any given point in time. You know how much you did. You have all kinds of metrics available to you. Now, I'm very worried about lots of metrics because it's very easy to incent bad behavior, but at least you have something objective. You know how many tests are passing. You know how many stories are left unplayed. You know what these different queues look like. You know where you are. You have visibility into what is actually happening with the team and where the project actually is, rather than these guesses on percent complete. You have a lot of adaptation going on. Evolutionary architecture, we've got refactoring, all of these different adaptations are there to respond to reality, to respond to the changes in reality, to respond to things like regulatory changes, or new technology, or new threats. When we look, we'll just pick on security for a moment. With the number of new threats that are out there, having to specify 9 months in advance specifically what your penetration testing might look like, that's irresponsible. You want to know that you can continually put in additional tests against known vulnerabilities. You want to be able to do that. You want to be able to adapt because that environment that you're deploying into is changing and you need to be able to adapt to it. And I kind of look at this as adaptive or evolutionary everything. Now, I got into a discussion with Neil Ford. He used to talk about emergent architecture. And I really prefer evolutionary architecture to emergent architecture because to me that calls out our ability to explicitly say what good looks like. I want my architecture to evolve towards these characteristics. Emergent does seem a bit ad hoc, whereas evolutionary communicates, to me at least, that I can say, for this particular application, this is what a good architecture looks like. And for this particular application, maybe something else. One of the clients I worked with in central London, they had a sandwich ordering system that about 60 people used every day. I would never run a load test on the sandwich ordering system